Munich, early 1980s. Freddie Mercury was living in one of the most expensive apartments in the city, surrounded by luxury, parties, and people who called him a genius every single night. From the outside, it looked like freedom. Success. Excess earned after years of discipline and control. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. There was one man, always nearby, always watching, always whispering ideas into Freddie's ear, who slowly began to change the way Freddie lived, trusted, and even saw himself. Not with force. Not with threats. With permission. What started as companionship turned into influence. What felt like escape became dependence. And before Freddie realized it, the man he trusted most was quietly leading him into the loneliest, most destructive years of his life. Who was this person? Why did Freddie let him in? And how close did Queen come to losing Freddie forever? Stay with this story. And if you want the untold, uncomfortable truths behind legends, subscribe now. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't loud, they're invited. When Freddie moved to Munich, he told everyone the same thing. I need air. After years of relentless touring, studio pressure, and the constant presence of Queen, the band, the expectations, the history, Freddie wanted distance. Not from the music, he insisted, but from the version of himself that felt permanently watched. Munich felt anonymous in a way London never had. The clubs were darker. The nights were longer. People didn't stare the same way. Freddie could disappear into a crowd and feel, briefly, like just another man with a drink in his hand instead of a legend with a crown. At first, it was intoxicating. He rented a lavish apartment, filled it with art, mirrors, music equipment, and people who came and went without asking questions. The parties were legendary, not just for the excess, but for the absence of rules. No schedules. No rehearsals. No band meetings. Just now. That was when the man appeared, quietly, effortlessly, as if he had always belonged there. He wasn't famous. He wasn't loud. He didn't demand attention the way others did. He listened. He observed. And most importantly, he never challenged Freddie. At least not at first. He laughed at Freddie's jokes. Agreed with his frustrations. Reinforced the idea that Freddie had been held back, constrained, misunderstood. That Queen needed Freddie more than Freddie needed Queen. You've given them everything, he would say casually, pouring another drink. When do you get to live for yourself? Freddie liked that question. It echoed something he already felt but hadn't dared to say out loud. The man became a constant presence, not dramatic, not obvious. Just, there. At breakfast. At parties. In the studio. In the late hours when the music stopped and the silence became uncomfortable. He encouraged indulgence without ever forcing it. Suggested another night out. Another drink. Another escape. You work too hard, he'd say. You deserve this. And Freddie, who had spent his entire life earning love through performance, finally felt accepted without effort. That was the hook. Because acceptance without conditions feels like safety, until it becomes a cage. Slowly, subtly, the rhythm of Freddie's life began to change. He slept less. Recorded at odd hours. Missed calls from London. Ignored messages from the band. Brian noticed first. Freddie sounds distracted, he said during a call. Freddie laughed it off. Darling, I'm inspired. But inspiration started arriving late, erratic, unfocused. Sessions dragged on. Nights bled into mornings. The man was always there, encouraging, approving, insulating Freddie from anything that felt like responsibility. Queen became background noise. And for the first time in his life, Freddie didn't feel guilty about it. He felt justified. What Freddie didn't see, or didn't want to see, was how small his world was becoming. How his circle was shrinking. How dissenting voices quietly disappeared. People who questioned the lifestyle were dismissed. People who reminded Freddie of deadlines or health or balance were labeled boring, controlling, irrelevant. The man never said, "Cut them off." He didn't need to. Freddie did it himself. One night, after another long party, Freddie sat alone on the balcony, city lights flickering below. The music inside thumped faintly. The man joined him, handing him a drink. "You look tired," he said. Freddie smiled faintly. "I'm free." The man nodded. "Exactly." Freddie didn't notice how the word free had started to mean alone. Or how the person standing beside him was slowly becoming the center of his universe, not because Freddie chose him consciously, but because everyone else was being pushed quietly into the dark. And somewhere deep inside, a part of Freddie knew something was wrong. But it was easier not to look. At first, Freddie didn't notice the shift. That was the most dangerous part of it. Control rarely arrives announcing itself. It doesn't knock loudly or demand obedience. It settles in slowly, disguised as concern, loyalty, protection. And Freddie, who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, mistook that control for care. The man never told Freddie what to do. He told Freddie what not to worry about. "You don't need to answer that," he'd say when the phone rang too late or too early. "They'll understand," when a session was missed. "Let them wait," when London called. At first, Freddie laughed along. Queen had always waited. Queen had always adapted around him. That was the unspoken truth of the band's dynamic. Freddie was the engine, volatile, brilliant, demanding, and the others had learned how to orbit him without collision. So when calls went unanswered, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like independence. But independence, Freddie would later realize, can become isolation when someone else is quietly deciding which voices you hear. The man positioned himself as a filter. Messages passed through him. Schedules were handled. Invitations were postponed. Freddie trusted him, not blindly, but comfortably. Trust, after all, had always come easily to Freddie when it was wrapped in affirmation. "You're exhausted," the man would say when Freddie hesitated. "You don't owe anyone explanations." Freddie repeated those words to himself when guilt flickered. When Brian's voice sounded tighter on the phone. When Roger's jokes carried an edge he didn't remember hearing before. "They'll get over it," Freddie told himself. But something subtle was happening beneath the surface. Freddie's days lost shape. He slept when he collapsed. Ate when someone reminded him. Recorded in bursts of manic focus followed by long stretches of emptiness. The man was always present in those in-between moments, when the music stopped and Freddie didn't know what to do with himself. The man filled the silence. Another drink. Another party. Another distraction. And whenever Freddie felt doubt creep in, that nagging sense that he was drifting away from himself, the man had the perfect answer. "You're reinventing yourself," he'd say. "Artists have to destroy old versions to survive." That sounded poetic. It sounded brave. It sounded like exactly the kind of justification Freddie wanted. Queen's absence became more noticeable then. Not just physically, but emotionally. Freddie stopped sharing unfinished ideas with them. Stopped asking for opinions. Stopped imagining how Brian would layer harmonies or how Roger would drive a rhythm. He began creating alone, or surrounded by people who applauded everything equally. One night, Freddie reached for the phone instinctively, ready to call Brian about a melody stuck in his head. His finger hovered over the number. The man noticed. "You don't need them for that," he said lightly. "You know exactly what you want." Freddie hesitated. Then he put the phone down. That moment would echo later, louder than any argument, because it wasn't a fight that pulled Freddie away from Queen. It was permission. The man never criticized the band directly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he framed everything as concern for Freddie. They don't see how hard this is for you. They expect too much. They'll always take, Freddie. That's what bands do. And Freddie, already tired, already craving rest from being needed, absorbed the narrative without realizing how deeply it was sinking in. He began canceling meetings. Delaying projects. Pushing commitments further into the future. When confronted, he grew defensive, not because he didn't care, but because admitting concern would mean admitting vulnerability. And vulnerability felt dangerous now. The man stood beside him constantly, in studios, in clubs, in private moments, reinforcing the idea that Freddie didn't need anyone else. "You have me," he'd say. "That's enough." But it wasn't. Freddie felt it in the quiet moments, the ones the parties couldn't drown out. In the early mornings when the apartment smelled of smoke and stale alcohol. In the mirror, where his own eyes sometimes looked unfamiliar. There were days when he woke up and couldn't remember when he'd last spoken to the band properly. Days when his voice felt tired, his body slower, his thoughts scattered. He told himself it was freedom. But freedom didn't feel like this. Freedom didn't feel like constantly needing distraction to avoid being alone with your own mind. One evening, after a rare call from London that left Freddie shaken and angry, he confronted the man, not directly, but cautiously. "They think I'm disappearing," Freddie said. The man smiled calmly. "They're afraid of losing control." That word again. Control. Freddie didn't argue. He poured another drink. Because arguing would mean questioning the one person who had made him feel safe in a world that suddenly felt too loud, too demanding, too sharp. And so, without realizing it, Freddie crossed an invisible line. From choosing distance to being guided away. Freddie didn't realize it all at once. There was no dramatic confrontation. No shouting. No single sentence that shattered the illusion. The realization came quietly, the way truth often does when it's been waiting patiently for denial to loosen its grip. It happened on a night that should have meant nothing. Another party. Another crowded apartment filled with people laughing too loudly, music thumping through the walls, glasses clinking, smoke curling into the corners of the ceiling. Freddie stood in the center of it all, playing host without really hosting, smiling without fully feeling it. The man was nearby, as always, relaxed, confident, moving through the room like he belonged there more than anyone else. Freddie excused himself to step into the hallway, needing air, silence, something real. The noise dulled behind him as he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. That was when he heard it. The man's voice. Not speaking to Freddie. Speaking about him. "He won't notice," the man said casually, laughter in his tone. "He never does." Freddie's eyes opened. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. Another voice responded, someone Freddie barely recognized. "You're sure he's fine with it?" The man laughed again. "He's Freddie Mercury. He has everything. What's one more thing?" Freddie's chest tightened. They were talking about money. About favors. About access. About using Freddie's name to smooth problems, open doors, make things disappear. And the worst part wasn't what they were saying. It was how normal it sounded. Like this wasn't the first time. Freddie stayed perfectly still, pressed into the shadowed hallway, heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. His mind raced backward, replaying moments he'd brushed off before, the unexplained expenses, the sudden generosity, the people who thanked him for things he didn't remember agreeing to. The man continued, unaware. "He trusts me. That's enough." That sentence landed harder than anything else. Trust. Freddie felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not anger. Not yet. Shame. Because the truth was painful in a way that pride couldn't soften, Freddie had wanted to be trusted so badly that he'd stopped asking who deserved it. He stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. The party noise swallowed him again as he re-entered the room, his smile returning automatically, too automatically. The man noticed immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked, handing Freddie a drink. Freddie took it without thinking, his fingers brushing the glass like it might burn him. "Perfect," Freddie said. The man smiled, satisfied. That smile changed everything. Freddie watched him for the rest of the night, really watched him, and suddenly the patterns were impossible to ignore. The way he hovered near decisions. The way he intercepted conversations. The way he spoke for Freddie in moments that didn't belong to him. Freddie felt foolish. Not because he'd been deceived. Because he'd participated. He remembered defending the man when others questioned him. Remembered dismissing concern as jealousy or misunderstanding. Remembered choosing comfort over confrontation every time doubt tried to surface. The party blurred after that. Freddie drank too much, laughed too loudly, touched too many shoulders without really connecting. Inside, something had cracked, not violently, but irrevocably. Late that night, after the last guest had left and the apartment finally went quiet, Freddie sat alone on the floor, back against the couch, staring at nothing. The man joined him, relaxed, unbothered. "You disappeared earlier," he said lightly. "Everything okay?" Freddie looked up at him slowly. "How long," Freddie asked, voice calm, "have you been making decisions for me?" The man didn't flinch. "I take care of things." "That wasn't the question," Freddie said. A pause. "Why?" Freddie continued. "Why do you need to speak for me?" The man sighed, as if tired. "Because you don't like dealing with details. Because you trust me." Freddie nodded once. "Yes," he said. "I trusted you." The word hung between them, heavy and final. The man's expression shifted, not guilt, not fear, annoyance. "You're overreacting." That was the moment Freddie knew. People who care don't dismiss your discomfort. Freddie stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "I want you to leave." The man stared at him, incredulous. "Freddie." "Leave," Freddie repeated. Quiet. Controlled. Dangerous. The man laughed once, sharp. "You'll regret this." Freddie met his gaze without blinking. "I already regret letting you stay." The door closed behind the man minutes later. The apartment felt suddenly enormous. Empty. Silent. Freddie slid down the wall and sat on the floor, shaking, not from fear, but from the delayed impact of realization. He had been used. Not because he was weak. But because he was lonely. And as the city lights flickered outside, Freddie Mercury finally allowed himself to feel something he'd avoided for too long. Grief, not just for the trust he'd lost. But for the time he'd given away without noticing. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument Freddie had ever been part of. No music. No voices. No constant movement of people filling the space. Just the low hum of the city outside and the echo of a decision that could not be undone. Freddie didn't sleep that night. He paced the apartment slowly, barefoot, stepping over traces of a life that suddenly felt, glasses left behind, cigarette smoke still clinging to the curtains, a record spinning aimlessly until he lifted the needle and stopped it. Every room carried evidence of how much control he had handed over. And now that control was gone, what replaced it wasn't relief. It was damage. The first call came early the next morning. London. Freddie stared at the phone for a long moment before answering. He already knew what was coming. "Where the hell have you been?" Roger's voice exploded through the line, stripped of humor, stripped of patience. "Do you have any idea what's been happening here?" Freddie closed his eyes. "I'm listening." Brian came on the line next, calmer but no less serious. "We've had contracts delayed. Sessions cancelled without our knowledge. People speaking on your behalf, Freddie. Making decisions none of us agreed to. Freddie's chest tightened. "That won't happen again," he said quietly. There was a pause. John's voice followed, softer, measured. "It already has." That sentence hurt more than anger would have. Freddie sat down slowly, gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't realize how much he'd inserted himself." Roger scoffed. "You didn't want to." The accusation landed, but Freddie didn't fight it. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I do now." Another silence. Brian sighed. "We've been worried. Not about the music. About you." That was worse. Because Freddie had built his independence on the idea that Queen was holding him back, and now here they were, still standing, still trying to protect him even after he'd pushed them away. "I made a mess," Freddie said finally. Roger exhaled sharply. "That's one way to put it." Freddie braced himself for the confrontation he knew was coming, the anger, the blame, the distance. But instead, something unexpected happened. Brian asked quietly, "Are you safe?" Freddie hesitated. "Yes," he said. "Now I am." That answer carried more truth than explanation ever could. Later that day, Freddie met with lawyers. Managers. People who spoke in numbers and implications and consequences. The man had left damage behind, financial confusion, strained relationships, commitments made without Freddie's full understanding. Each revelation felt like another layer peeling back. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. It was systemic. Freddie signed papers with a steady hand that didn't feel steady at all. He listened as people explained how deeply he'd been compromised, not intentionally, not maliciously, but thoroughly. And through it all, one thought kept repeating in his mind. "I let this happen." That night, Freddie called Brian again. "I need to see you," he said. There was no hesitation this time. "We'll come to you." When the band finally reunited in person, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No emotional speeches. Just four men sitting in a quiet room, older than they'd been before, weighed down by things that hadn't existed when they first started. Freddie spoke first. "I thought I needed to get away from you to be free," he said. "Turns out, I just got lost." Brian looked at him steadily. "You didn't get lost. You stopped checking the map." Roger leaned back, arms crossed. "So what now?" Freddie inhaled deeply. "Now I take responsibility." John nodded. "That's all anyone can ask." There was no instant forgiveness. No clean slate. Trust doesn't regenerate that quickly. But something important happened in that room. Freddie stopped pretending. He admitted the loneliness. The exhaustion. The temptation to let someone else carry the weight of decision-making. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't glamorize it. He owned it. And in doing so, he reclaimed something the man had quietly taken from him, his agency. When the meeting ended, Freddie stayed behind with Brian. "I was scared," Freddie admitted quietly. "Scared that without chaos, I'd feel empty." Brian smiled sadly. "Chaos doesn't fill emptiness. It just distracts from it." Freddie nodded. As Brian left, Freddie stood alone in the room, breathing in the quiet, not the empty kind this time, but the kind that felt earned. The worst years hadn't ended cleanly. But they had ended honestly. And for Freddie Mercury, that mattered more than saving face. Rebuilding didn't happen all at once. There was no single decision, no dramatic turning point that suddenly fixed what had been broken. Freddie learned quickly that damage created quietly does not disappear loudly. It lingers. It echoes. And it demands patience, something Freddie had never been particularly good at. The first thing he had to rebuild was trust. Not just with Queen. With himself. In the months that followed, Freddie moved differently. Slower. More deliberate. The parties didn't vanish overnight, but they lost their urgency. The apartment felt less crowded. The silence, once terrifying, became something he began to tolerate, even need. He returned to the studio with caution, not bravado. Sessions were shorter. Focused. He listened more than he spoke. For a man who had built his legend on instinct and excess, restraint felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. But it also felt real. Brian noticed the change first. Freddie asked questions again. Not rhetorical ones. Not performative ones. Real questions. What do you think? Does this work? Is this too much? At first, the band didn't know how to respond. They had grown used to Freddie arriving fully formed, commanding, untouchable. This version, quieter, self-aware, occasionally uncertain, felt almost fragile. Roger joked about it once. "You're going soft on us." Freddie smiled faintly. "Or maybe I'm finally paying attention." John, ever observant, said nothing, but he stayed closer now. Watching. Grounding. There were setbacks. Nights when Freddie slipped back into old habits. Mornings when shame arrived before clarity. Moments when he missed the illusion of control more than the reality of accountability. Those moments frightened him. Because they reminded him how easy it was to disappear again. He began surrounding himself with fewer people, not because he wanted isolation, but because he wanted honesty. Anyone who stayed had to be comfortable with quiet, with boundaries, with not being needed every second. That alone cleared the room faster than any confrontation ever had. Freddie also had to face something deeper than external damage. Loneliness. The kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from not being known. He had let the wrong person fill that void because the void itself scared him. And now, without distraction, it stared back at him every night. Some evenings, he sat alone with a piano, fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. Music no longer poured out effortlessly. It arrived cautiously, like something that didn't quite trust him yet. That hurt more than any argument. But Freddie stayed. He stayed with the discomfort. With the emptiness. With the process of earning back his own voice, creatively and emotionally. When Queen toured again, the dynamic felt different. Not weaker. More balanced. Freddie still commanded the stage, that never left him. But off stage, he leaned on the band more openly. Accepted input. Shared weight. It didn't make him smaller. It made him sustainable. There were moments when he wanted to explain himself publicly. To correct narratives. To reclaim his image. He never did. Because some truths aren't meant for headlines. They're meant for survival. One night, after a long rehearsal, Freddie lingered behind while the others packed up. Brian noticed. "You all right?" he asked. Freddie nodded slowly. "I think so." Brian hesitated. "You don't have to prove anything to us anymore." Freddie smiled, not the stage smile, not the armor, the tired, sincere one. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm learning." The years didn't erase what had happened. They didn't undo the damage completely. But they taught Freddie something he had never been allowed to learn before. That being admired was not the same as being supported. And that support didn't come from surrendering control, but from choosing who deserved it. Freddie Mercury rebuilt his life not by returning to who he was before, but by becoming someone who no longer needed to disappear to feel alive. There are truths that only surface when noise finally fades. Not in moments of chaos. Not during applause. But in the quiet hours, when distractions no longer work and honesty has nowhere left to hide. For Freddie Mercury, that quiet arrived late. By then, the worst years were behind him. The influence was gone. The control reclaimed. The band restored. On the surface, everything looked steady again, productive, focused, even triumphant. But internally, Freddie was still carrying something unresolved. Guilt. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that demands forgiveness. The quieter kind, the one that whispers you should have known better when the room goes dark. Freddie rarely spoke about that man again. Not because the memory didn't matter, but because naming it gave it more power than it deserved. What stayed with him wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the realization of how vulnerable he had been. How willing. He understood now that loneliness had made him careless. That exhaustion had softened his boundaries. That wanting peace had led him to hand control to someone who never earned it. That admission didn't destroy him. But it humbled him. There were moments, years later, when Freddie sat alone at Garden Lodge, the house quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. He would pour himself a drink, not excessively, not ritualistically, and stare into the reflection of the glass. "I wanted it to be easier," he once said softly to no one in particular. That was the truth he had taken the longest to accept. He hadn't been manipulated solely by charm or deception. He had been manipulated by his own need for rest. By the deep fatigue of carrying a persona larger than himself for decades without pause. Freddie didn't regret trusting people. What he regretted was trusting them more than he trusted his own discomfort. There were warning signs he'd ignored because facing them meant facing himself. And that was harder. In conversations with those closest to him, Freddie became more reflective in his later years. Less theatrical. More deliberate. "I confused escape with freedom," he admitted once, quietly. That sentence carried everything. The late nights. The indulgence. The distance from the band. The years that blurred together until they barely felt lived. He had escaped responsibility, yes. But he had also escaped connection. And connection, he finally understood, was the one thing he had needed most. Freddie never framed himself as a victim. That mattered to him. Victimhood felt passive, and Freddie had always believed in agency, even when he failed to use it well. Instead, he framed the experience as a lesson he paid for dearly. One that reshaped how he loved. How he trusted. How he chose who stayed close. As time passed, Freddie grew more protective of his inner world. Less available to people who wanted access instead of intimacy. More selective with who heard his fears instead of just his laughter. And in that selectivity, he found peace. Not perfection. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing your weaknesses and respecting them instead of pretending they don't exist. In the final years, when illness entered the picture and priorities narrowed even further, that lesson became invaluable. Freddie no longer let others decide what mattered. He chose presence over chaos. Honesty over distraction. He stayed grounded. He stayed himself. Looking back, Freddie once reflected on that chapter of his life with a mix of sadness and clarity. "I don't blame him anymore," he said of the man who had led him into the darkest years. "I blame the version of myself that didn't believe he deserved better." That was the admission that arrived too late to change the past, but not too late to change the man he became. Freddie Mercury didn't lose himself forever. But he came close enough to understand how fragile identity can be when you're tired, adored, and alone. And that understanding stayed with him. Quietly. Powerfully. As one of the most important truths of his life, never shouted, never sung on stage, but carried all the same.